We are live. Welcome back to Two Liberals and a Marxist, coming to you from Rome, from Cyprus, from America. It is your three favorite political commentators, Professor James Ker Linday, Michael Rossi, and me, Pyotr Kurzin.
Professor Michael Rossi. I went
through almost a decade. I went through a decade of PhD almost to get that.
Oh, you're a professor as well. Sorry. It's just because you don't put it on there. Also, guys, we are testing something out. I've turned on this show comments on stage thing. So, all your comments will be on stage with this. If it gets really dicey, I will switch them off. Or if you're really nasty, then I will just kick you out for a bit. So give you a timeout. So that's just in the bottom right there for those of you who see it on your screen. We've got quite a diverse conversation here, guys, isn't it? It's been, 2 or 3 weeks since we were last together. And obviously the world being what it is right now, loads has happened. And I think we have quite we've sort of found a way to bring it all together. But the first thing I think we were going to touch upon is a bit of Russia and Putin and things like that, and then maybe go towards Ukraine, Operation Spiderweb, and then also Trump and his relationship to that. And then obviously right now, as we talk about this, he's deploying the National Guard in LA. So there's quite a large amount of things. We might also touch upon the Polish elections. I know some of you wanted to hear about that. As always, there's so much, and we probably won't cover it all. But if there's anything specific you want us to touch upon, then drop a comment below, questions, etc., and we'll try to get them or weave them in. But anyway, guys, I don't know, where should we start? It's always like this.
Well, Pyotr, last time we were in touch, you were down in Namibia, and just maybe sort of give some thoughts on what's going there. I mean, you mentioned that you were sort of there were some interesting maneuvers with what Russia has been doing in southern Africa. I mean, it's obviously been a really, really interesting story. I was just reading a couple of days ago about Wagner Group leaving Mali. But you sort of mentioned there was some aspect on that you thought was actually sort of worth taking a note on. So maybe just sort of say how your trip to Namibia went and what you're seeing from down there.
Yeah, so for people who aren't aware, I love to travel. I've lived in Africa. I've done a lot of stuff. So apart from my passion for geopolitics, I really enjoy trying to sort of connect where it is that we're talking about with actual places in the world. So I worked across East Africa predominantly in my earlier years, sort of as part of the UN capacity, and this trip was basically just the first time I've been back in a few years. And a few things really struck me in the first instance. One, that Namibia is the second most sparsely populated country in the world. It's 3 million people, population whole, but it's the size of, I think, 2 Germanys. So it's incredibly, just vacant of people, and the people who are there work very hard to make the country what it is, and the country's actually developed quite a lot. What's interesting is that it's actually got one of the highest growing inequalities in the world as well. So the people who have stuff, they have it, but when they're, and that's partially due to foreign influence, and this is where Russia and China, especially China, come in. So all the major infrastructure projects, all the major elements to do with, mining, 90% of contracts are basically given to the Chinese through the Belt and Road Initiative. So it's a really interesting illustration of these things that we talk about in a theoretical sense, or abstract sense, in practice. Where Russia comes into it, though, is through specifically, obviously, oil and more of the raw commodities element. And the Russians have been, surprisingly to my mind, more sort of present here than I thought. I thought it was mainly around the Sahel or Central Africa, northern, because it's closer to home. Historically, it's not. They actually have a huge role there. And the only thing that I kept hearing from people who, former Namibian soldiers in the Namibian War, Civil War, or whatever the Boer War, is that the Russians would always come drunk to do their jobs, working in the oil, whatever position. So the stereotypes that we all think of Russians as being X, Y, and Z, it apparently is the case for even Africans. They're like, wow, these guys like to drink a lot. And these are Boer men, right? They're big, huge men, people who've been there, and they're like, what, they can drink us under the table. So the Russians have a reputation from one, economics and activity, but also to the cultural element. And so bringing this to the point is that it made me begin to reevaluate my assessment of Russia's ability to exert its influence or just have a presence much further than we might think. We think America, Chinese as being the predominant ones, but Russia does actually do quite a lot with maybe not as much. And it did make me respect a bit more Russia's tenacity, if you like, at being specialized or targeted in how they do things. So they're very much about the raw commodities. They very much have a strong say in anything to do with oil and gas or anything of that sort of more of the energy area, I guess. The Chinese very much control the sort of raw commodities element. But you can see all this in terms of language. Certain places there was just Russian food or written. One place called Swakop was very much German, but there are a lot of Russian influences there. Like in the center, I just went and had some goulash in the middle of Africa in sort of 30 degrees heat. I'm having some warm soup, a meaty soup. So it's very interesting like that. And sort of to bring it more to the current events, as you said, James. Yeah, right now the Russians are pulling out of Mali and they are shifting their focus towards Central Africa. And I think there's a couple of specific reasons for that. Firstly, Sudan's civil war has stabilized, but the ceasefire has been sustained, and South Sudan is looking, as you know, James, you and I did a video on that. Separately, is looking rocky, and then obviously there's Chad and CAR and DRC. So I think Russia wants to try to deepen its influence down there, and maybe are giving up a little bit on the Islamic jihadism of Mali. So yeah, it was a very interesting trip, and we can talk more about that. But that's sort of an overarching. Well, yeah. I don't know what you guys think of that, but yeah, it's very interesting to see how it plays out on the ground.
No, it's fascinating to hear. I mean, Namibia has obviously got such an interesting history as well, and the fact that it was this sort of South African apartheid colony for a long time. This brutal history with Germany, as of course, it was often termed, the first genocide of the 20th century. There, and it must have been a fascinating trip to go and see it.
Well, we actually got passed by both the heads of state. So we had a convoy of about 16 cars, which is the president, so the newly elected president. And then we also had the prime minister. They were going up there to celebrate 35 years worth of independence. What I also have learned is on the African side, Namibian side, they're an extremely proud nation, but there's also a lot of underlying resentment and obviously, I know xenophobia is the right word, but like an animosity towards South Africa, because obviously Namibia was known as Southwestern Africa for many a year until they gained independence in 1990. So there's a lot of there's that rumbling feeling, and it's such a young country still. So they've done a lot, but that comes back to the foreign influence and investments from China, Russia. That's the other point, right? To talk about the West, for example, the Americans are nowhere.
That's what I was about to ask. Like, where's the Americans in all of this?
Nowhere. The Germans are the main ones, obviously, colonially. And I think what's interesting is that the Germans are actually, this, not to get into the debate about reparations, but the Germans are doing it in a very specific way. So they are paying to support days of remembrance or not just giving citizens money. They're investing it in ways of sort of, expressing the country's sovereignty and finding national days of memorial or whatever, which I think is quite a classy way of doing it. James, we have lost you, just so you know. So yeah. Anyway, not sure what's happened to James, but El Gato looks very good. But anyway, so Michael, I mean, so yeah, the Americans not anywhere. Does that surprise you?
No, not really. Not really at all. Just listening to what there he is. Okay, good. Just before I get into my own little commentary here, you've already gotten into trouble on the comment sections because you equated goulash with Russian food, and that's already a major faux pas here.
Michael, don't deflect from the fact that we've got people demanding you apologize to the Bolts and Kaya Kallas. You know, yeah.
I'm already in trouble because I said Russian goulash isn't is Russian, it's Hungarian. Well,
yes, it's Hungarian. How dare you?
Variations of Russia, you know. Anyway,
yeah. Wait, do I owe Kaya Kallas an apology for something?
Well, apparently there was some unhappiness with previous comments on the Baltics.
Oh, well,
so,
somehow I'm sure she'll,
just so you know,
I'm sure she'll get over it.
Don't worry, we're going to talk about Serbia. We're going to talk about the Baltics.
Oh, by the way, actually, and there, if I remember rightly, for any Serbian viewers and or from the Balkans, in actual fact, that Marti Ahtisaari cut his teeth on Namibia. That was the first of the sort of big conflicts that he got involved with, and then Aceh came after that. But if I remember rightly, it was Namibia.
I've put in the comments below for anyone who is interested the link to my travel channel, which is going to be a mixture of more travel. But whilst I was there, I did climb the single biggest freestanding sand dune in the world, 400 feet high. Scary as it sounds, wind across 3 different directions, sand everywhere. I'm wearing a pair of pants which has still got sand in them. I don't think my father's going to be happy with the sand in his study, but nevertheless, so if people are interested in travel content as well, but I think the thing, guys, that really makes it come home for me is, like, you know, to bring it to Ukraine, to sort of bring in some of the themes we want to talk about more, is that Ukraine is the single biggest conflict of the 21st century, arguably since the Second World War, right, for its global implications. But in terms of deaths, I think we've said this before, right, on our chats, but like the South Sudanese war between 2014 and 2018, 400,000 people not casualties, they died.
Yeah.
And it's I think it's the scale of the conflicts that happen in Africa, but because we just don't know about it, no one cares, or because we don't care about it, no one knows, or whatever, right? So that's the other thing I really learned. It's just how many people died in these wars.
Yeah.
In the West and
so
stuff.
I mean, it seems to me that Africa and especially Central West Africa. We were just talking about Wagner pulling out of Mali and them having a presence in CAR, Niger, among others. This is largely the area of Africa that almost everyone outside of the French completely neglects. Namibia is considered to be far more developed. What's interesting is really 2 things that brought out, and again, you're far more the expert on it than I am, is that 1, Namibia is considered to be one of the more stable and developed countries. Number 2, I'm interested to see what the relationship is between Namibia and South Africa. You touched on the idea that Namibia was sort of a protectorate. If some folks here aren't familiar with this, Namibia was a German colony up till the end of the First World War, and was given a type of protectorate status under British South Africa. One of the first things that the newly formed League of Nations had done. This is one of the things that gives credence to the so-called Trustee Council that does not know what to do with unincorporated territories. And if it gained sovereignty, it finally gained independence only about 30 to 35 years ago. I mean, this is relatively new information to most people who aren't experts in the field.
No, I think it's... Sorry, go on, Michael.
No, I did go. I mean, and the third thing I was going to sort of mention is that, as far as Africa is concerned, whether it's South Africa, East Africa, West Africa, pretty much all of Africa outside of, let's say, Egypt and South Africa, it tends to be peripheral news, which is not surprising that the Chinese and the Russians are making inroads into the continent now for their own reasons. I'm pretty certain that Russia's whole reason for being there is playing on narratives of post-colonialism, narratives of world systems theory. Somebody within the Ministry of Foreign Policy, Foreign Affairs in Russia has, read up on all of the, requisite political science literature, and is playing on the animosity of the rest, having a voice and a foothold outside of the so-called West.
Yeah, I would say a couple of things, and then I'll ask a question to both of you to sort of maybe begin pivoting the conversation a little bit more. But one of the things that's really, I think, fascinating about this specific area is Southern Africa, which is sort of around from, some people debate whether Angola's in it, but from sort of Namibia upwards to around Mozambique, right? That's where the economic bloc is called. It's the equivalent of ECOWAS. I forget what the Southern African one is called. It's one of the more, it's probably the most stable. Yes, yeah. It's probably the most stable sub-region on the continent, and a large proportion of that is obviously South Africa being the most wealthy nation. But as South Africa gets worse, it is having repercussions on other countries. Not like really bad, like this something terrorist attacks, but like there is an inevitable knock-on effect in terms of economic uncertainty because Namibia depends hugely on energy and whatever goods trade with South Africa. But then there's also the historical component of communism, right? I don't think a lot of people understand that the Cubans was so active in the Angolan Civil War, and by extension, the war across the border with Namibia or South Africa at the time. 40,000 troops from Cuba actually came to this part of the world. And obviously, who was funding them? The Soviets, or giving them arms and all this sort of stuff. So Russia has had a historical relationship to this area. And I think it's that historical precedence that has given Russia a desire, the Kremlin, to continue to have some kind of foothold. But they clearly, I think, are beginning to focus more on this central part of Africa. And so this leads me to my question, which is sort of, do you guys think, maybe James, I don't know if you want to have a pop at this, but like, do you think there comes a point where Russia is overextending itself? Because we've seen them unable to come to the support of Armenia when they activated the CSTO, was it last year? We've seen them, neglecting the events with Syria. They've lost that base. Now they have to do it more from Libya. So, do you think Russia does have a limit on how far they can exert their influence compared to the other two big players?
Gosh, it's because these fly under the radar. So, for regular viewers will know that my particular area that I've spent many years working on is Southeast Europe. And I think I take my cue on that is that we're seeing obviously a lot of Russian activity in Southeast Europe, but it's more making mischief and troublemaking. I think in this one it's rather interesting because it seems that there is a business component there. The Russia is leveraging areas where it's got expertise, and I think what's the old expression of walk and chew gum. Russia is definitely not the power that it once was, but it doesn't mean that it's wholly incapable, as you've pointed out, of being able to do several different things at once, even now. And I think this is probably what we're missing in a lot of these stories. So we're very focused on Ukraine, but there has been talk about what it was doing in West Africa, but it hasn't been given a lot of attention. Especially since Prigozhin died, was killed, assassinated. That whole story about Wagner has sort of really, really dropped off the front pages, and yet it has still been taking a role in certain places. And I think it's really interesting you raise this element. And as I say, it is an actor, and it quite clearly, there is real concern about sort of as well hybrid activities. Nobody's taking their eye off the ball when it comes to sort of, for example, online misinformation, disinformation activities that Russia is doing. So it doesn't surprise me. And I think sometimes maybe we do get a little too focused on what is going on in Ukraine and thinking that Russia must be sending absolutely everything and anything into that, and absolutely nothing else is happening elsewhere. And obviously that isn't the case. You start piecing it together and you can see all these different examples of where it's doing things, not necessarily at a particularly high level, but it is still active.
Yeah, I think it's really crazy what we saw. What was it? I think it was about a year ago now, 11 months. The images coming out of the Wagner Group's decimation. There were some images of troops who were like, the jihadists had absolutely gone at them. And I think it showed you that once they were incorporated into the sort of Russian military complex more broadly, they lost that competitive edge if they ever had that. So I think the Russians have not been having an easy time in Mali. Everyone, all the pro-Kremlinites, pro-Putinists on Twitter and stuff were like, the French being kicked out. Watch the Russians come in. They're going to change things up, you idiots. haven't done any different. If anything, they've been worse than the French. So, I mean, what does that tell us about the relationship of the military structure to, well, the FSB? Actually, let's talk about. That's a good segue into Spiderweb, isn't it?
Before I just wanted to say, and thanks very much to Joe Mama, who gave a super chat, who asked a very specific question that I do want us to come back to, which is, why won't Trump capitalize on global instability, try and get a geopolitical win, Haiti with security, South Sudan with aid, etc. Many options, not much in terms of dollar cost to do. So I think that's definitely one that I'd like us to come back to and talk a little bit about, because I think it's a really, really great point. And thanks very much, Joe Mama, for that.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think that's a good point. Michael, you're sitting there with a pensive look on your face.
I'm not exactly sure what to make of Russia's presence in Africa. I know that the pro-Russia crowd is saying that we're kicking the French out, but what's their ultimate goal here? I mean, if the goal is just simply the defrankification of former French West Africa, then, you know, I guess mission accomplished here. The official statement from Wagner from a couple of days ago that they're pulling out of Mali is that they've accomplished their mission, that they have returned control of the capital to the government forces. That's what their mandate was, and that was it. Now, you know, most people don't pay that much attention to what's happening in Africa. As you pointed out, we're all, you know, all eyes are sort of fixed on Ukraine or the Middle East or Sudan or the United States, for that matter. So you can kind of take their statement at face value. If they're pulling out simply because they have given control back to the local forces, then, I mean, that's effectively what their mandate was. What their ultimate goal is in Africa may very well be more or less, in my opinion, part of the larger ideology of giving voice and feet and, I guess, I don't know, sovereign independence to the global South more than anything else. And what they end up doing with these countries is more so on a state-to-state basis. You know, it remains to be seen what really is going to happen, because oftentimes Russia will support these countries in their struggle against some kind of post-colonial struggle against the West, but that these countries aren't necessarily grateful to Russia, right? We're not expecting any kind of like long-term bilateral relations that happens. I mean, we certainly have good relations between Russia and South Africa, but this can change as far as governments change. As far as Russia's presence in Namibia is concerned, as far as I'm concerned, you know, that remains also to be seen. If the goal is, and, you know, I offer a class on Russian foreign policy, both at the undergrad and graduate levels, if the larger goal is simply to project a type of alternative global policy that emerging states don't necessarily need to latch on to Western countries or Western financial institutions as they did beforehand, this is something that Russia, China, and to a lesser extent, India and other emerging BRICS countries are sort of offering these countries within Africa.
Yeah, there's some really good podcasts at the moment, Foreign Affairs, and another one with, I think, Gideon Rachman of the FT, about sort of China's ability to exert itself through the BRI. And generally, I mean, it is such an illustration. I saw such a stark illustration of debt diplomacy in action when we were driving up from Swakop, which is this city where Peter Thiel actually grew up. He went to school there. So it's got quite a strong, unfortunate, dark past related to Nazism, actually. But if you go north of that towards a place called the Skeleton Coast, which is basically where lots of boats have gotten stuck on the sands and just ended up being abandoned, it's quite eerie. There's this 15-kilometer, I think it was, stretch of beachland, privately bought by the Chinese. And that's the way that the Namibian government paid off some of the debt. They're literally just, China's literally, it's a new form of colonialism. Some people argue that they're literally just physically buying up the country in terms of its territory, let alone, you know, controlling the assets in the major state corporations.
Yeah. So well, we find this in Tajikistan as well. Central Asia is that region where China is both a blessing and a curse, where China will come in with these large investment and construction projects, but they come with their own strings attached, and this is definitely a form of asymmetric interdependence, where the advantage is clearly in Beijing's side.
Elise has just put an interesting topic, which I'm going to just tackle right now, in my opinion, which is, no, I don't think I think he was earlier last year, but the economy in China is actually doing quite well. They're probably going to average about 4 or 5% growth this year, which is still more than double that of the US. Their economic uncertainties, economic headwinds of late last year have seemed to have stabilized. The fiscal policies they've introduced seem to be doing quite well, actually. So no, I think President Xi is looking better than he was 6 months ago. And anyway, it's very difficult to remove him. Remember the white paper revolutions, or the West's term for that, which was during COVID 2022, when loads of Chinese came out in protest against COVID policies. That was looking really rocky for Xi, that was just before he was re-elected for his unprecedented third term. So personally, I don't think so. We can all hope, but no, I don't think so. But yeah, anyway, I know probably we'll want to pivot to something more relatable from some of the audience, but I do think people should always keep an eye out for Africa. It's the only economy set to continent grow in economics. There are so many conflicts going on. And as I've always said to you guys in other conversations, for me, as we see a world which is increasingly, rejecting of international norms and principles, Africa is ironically the continent which is illustrating the countries that uphold those principles most of all, because they came out of the post-World War II system as sovereign states, and they recognize the importance of territorial integrity, sovereignty, and statehood and such. So I do encourage people to follow James. You and I do more African things, but when Michael does it as well, I'm sure you'll start translating Swahili now, Michael. I'm sure Afrikaans.
We have an influx of. We have apparently an influx of Afrikaans that are now seeking refuge in the United States now to escape the white genocide. So
I did a video on that recently. I did a video on that recently, and it's a bizarre story on all sorts of levels. But more generally, Pyotr, I completely agree. I've often said that one of the best things about doing the channel has been a chance to learn a lot about Africa. And it is absolutely fascinating. There is so much that goes on there that just really doesn't get the attention it deserves. Unfortunately, far too much of it pretty grim. One has to admit, but it is an absolutely fascinating continent. And I've sort of said we're more than just a little bit. If I went back again and chose another part of the world to specialize on, I think it probably would have been East Africa. I find it so interesting to sort of follow what's going on there, and the regulars on my channel will know that yes, I've done quite a lot on Somalia and Ethiopia, and in fact, actually, it certainly I see lots of interesting parallels with the Balkans, which sort of the balkanization sometimes I think helps make it make sense, if you see what I mean, without drawing exact parallels and saying it's exactly the same. But Ethiopia has an uncanny similarity to Yugoslavia.
No, I agree with you. I mean, Ethiopia, we could talk about the balkanization of that, because it's a country that has been made up of many different nationalities, as they call them, although tribes is what maybe some people might be understood more. We can talk about loads of different subregions. Biafra, is it Biafra? That sub-region of Nigeria.
Biafra, which had a horrific war in the late 1960s.
Of support in history, right? You had the Soviets and the Americans on one side, but against the Israelis and the French. Bizarre, and then obviously Somaliland, Puntland, and all this sort of stuff. So anyway,
but lots of historical things. Yeah. So just a quick shout out, anyone who's interested in Africa, follow Pyotr and myself, and Michael, of course, is always brilliant on translating important Putin speeches.
That's basically what we're saying. Follow us, not Michael. We're more interesting. Is what James is trying to say there.
No, Michael's terribly interesting, but it doesn't tend to do a lot on Africa, if I'm right.
No, I have to confess, it's something that you guys are far more versatile in. It's something that I need to shift some focus on. So, a part of being a good academic is knowing where your borders end and where the other experiences and expertise lies.
sort of comes in on it. Yeah, but
Sure.
it's yeah. By the way, yes, to Hoes and Oz. And I'm really not sure if I'm pronouncing that right or whether I should try and pronounce it correctly. Yeah, I was
just
thinking
reading
exactly
that now. Yes, I'm reading
the
that.
same the other night that there was probably quite a lot of Afrikaners, or 60 or so Afrikaners who just pitched up in the United States, looking very, very nervously on with Trump and Musk. And I know that we do want to talk a little bit about that a little later on.
Should we just talk about Trump, Musk, and the US side now, and then go and focus more on Ukraine at the end?
All right. Well, look, I just want to come back to that great question from Joe Mama about why isn't Trump trying to get those wins? And it's a great question because he's obviously angling for some sort of recognition. We know that he wants the Nobel Prize. Maybe he feels that these are just insignificant as compared with trying to do something on Ukraine. But I also suspect that, you said it doesn't cost a lot of money to solve, to send in troops to Haiti to try and stabilize the situation. But it doesn't make a lot of money. And I think that that's probably the crucial element in all of this. With Trump's transactionalism, it's that sort of coming together of something, what's high enough profile that's going to get him the attention and also going to make the money, whether for the United States or for him personally. And I suspect that that's what, trying to defend those sorts of actions of, sending vast amounts of aid to South Sudan, or sending US troops into Haiti to try and stabilize the situation is just not going to play well with the MAGA crowd. And there's no payback for it, as far as I can see. At least with Ukraine, you could say, and we've done this minerals deal, for example. So I suspect that that's what's behind it. But of course, we know that in terms of lives saved, any intervention in either of those or any of those situations can have an enormous effect. But for somebody who's just closed down USAID, with all the projected millions of deaths that's going to cause, I just don't think that is something that is on his radar, which I've always found really odd, because he seems to keep referencing the decision to involve the United States in Ukraine on the number of deaths that's taking place in Ukraine. And yet, as I say, at the very same time, as appalling as those deaths are, the projections show many, many more will be caused by what he's done in cutting aid elsewhere. So I think we're long beyond trying to understand Trump's mindset, frankly.
I think it's easy.
Well, I just wanted to make one thing clear, though.
Yeah, go ahead.
This show is brought to you by USAID. Yes, we are the only 3 remaining employees at USAID.
Let me jump in on that, because I still have to edit the video. But about a week before I left Tashkent, I spoke with a colleague of mine in Tashkent who works at the USAID office there, just to get a sense of what was really going on with that. And at the risk of giving away the plot before the movie is released on my channel, there were 2 questions that I had asked him. The first one is, like, what is the position, what is the status of US aid? Because apparently many people think that it's been effectively shut down. It has not. USAID workers are still there. They are effectively just given desk duty. They are, to my knowledge, paid up through the 1st of September. So, my colleague is sort of saying that for all of the rhetoric and bluster about USAID taking John Q taxpayers' money, they're being given full salaries through the summer, but are forbidden to do anything. They're not doing anything. They're not doing any projects. All the projects at best have either been told, finish out on the budget that you currently have and wrap it up. And the second...
So basically Trump is just following the court order that he can't sack people, but he's not following, so
yeah, that's it.
Semantics, really, isn't
it? No,
it's
semantics.
It hasn't changed the fact on the ground that, and yes, to those saying getting USAID mail checks and whatever, whatever.
I mean, the other thing is that some of the most outspoken people that will talk about how USAID is not this big global behemoth ready to convert the hearts and minds of people are people in USAID themselves, almost saying like, wow, I wish that our organization was as influential and as impactful as the conservative right like to make it out to be. To which I had asked a follow-up question, which is, given all of the accusations of USAID, and Trump gave this laundry list of money that was being given to, remember in his State of the Union address, which, kind of looked like a scene from Idiocracy Part 2 or whatever. I mean, it's like, wouldn't it be in USAID's interest to issue a rebuttal, issue some kind of response to all of this? And the fact of the matter is that the DC office just has remained just absolutely silent on it. So, for anybody that's thinking that the rumors of USAID sort of being this, fifth column element, this silent Soros weapon to influence the developing world. I mean, I've dealt with USAID. I tried to apply for a multi-year grant that would have partnered up American universities with the universities that I've been working at in Tashkent, simply to provide educational consulting to sort of the burgeoning educational environment within Uzbekistan, but also to give some of the best and brightest of my students a chance to study abroad in New York for a semester. It didn't go through. For one very simple reason. The USAID office in DC just was not interested in investing that much in Central Asia. So, to suggest that USAID is this active organization that seeks some type of subversive soft power in the world presupposes that it's actually a well-organized institution.
Look, I mean,
in fact, it's one big bloated bureaucracy that Trump. It was easy picking for Trump to just simply say, "I'm going to defund," and yet they're still getting full salaries up until the 1st of September,
but not doing anything. Michael, you're absolutely right. I mean, we know
there's no one left to get salaries. They've got like 12 employees left. He's axed the entire bloody thing. Half the Doge cuts were USAID.
Yeah, and also, I mean, by the way, and it was rather telling that somebody had posted a comment: the rest of the world should pay their fair share. And I actually wrote a response to it, but I think it's worth emphasizing this. The United States gives less as a proportion of its national income than any advanced economy in the world. It doesn't overpay for international aid, it underpays for international aid. And I think that's really, in absolute dollar terms, yes, it's a big sum, but as a proportion of the US economy, it's far less than and far less than European countries or Japan, for example, or South Korea or Australia. It really is. It's right at the bottom of that league. So I know that Americans get upset about this, and they're just fed this diet that the US is paying for everything. It's not.
I do think that
afford to do
Michael has a
more.
point there, James. I do think that from my time working in Africa, right, you would do a lot of stuff with USAID, right? There's a lot of overlap between UNEP, UNDP, loads of these organizations, and obviously DIFRA and USAID and all this sort of stuff. There were some schemes, money spent that was absolutely stupid, like gender equality programs in Afghanistan. It's not going to be useful there. The Taliban are not going to be recipient to these kinds of schemes. I'm not saying that I want women to have no rights, not at all. But you have to be more realistic about how far these schemes
that sounds a bit sort of blunt approach. I mean, the people I've met who work in development, look, and I'm not going to defend all development organizations. We know that a lot of them are bloated, and that there are these schemes that can. But if you take them in isolation, of course, you can sort of point out that there are schemes which might seem, wasteful. But you've also got to set that in the context of people sort of looking at priorities and thinking, where can you actually sort of make some sort of dent on deeper social problems. You know, these are countries which are deeply illiberal. So it might seem that funding sort of trans opera in Colombia is a desperate waste of money. But if this is a way that can actually in some way or another help to raise awareness of an issue that hopefully will contribute in some small way to the overall liberalization of society. You know, and I don't mean that in the sort of, you know, and this is where all the MAGA get really upset because, you know, it's like, oh, this is exactly what they want, liberalization. You know, they want to make everyone liberals. No, by that, I just mean trying to create a world where, you know, women have rights, disabled have rights, they're treated with respect, treated with tolerance, and they're allowed to make and get on in the world. That, you know, far too often I've seen it, but no, people with disability, for example, in so many societies are still kept locked away. And if some of the money can be spent in giving them opportunities to work, as so many can and want to, but they're kept locked away, they're marginalized in society. I think this is something that we shouldn't just say, oh, well, you know, it's wasteful spending. Look at it on a case-by-case basis. Look at the big picture.
Yeah, what I would say to that is two things. Mainly, number one, what I'm saying is that we have to be realistic. We have to meet them on their level, right? One of the biggest alienations that has happened in parts of the developing world or global south towards the West specifically is this sort of prescriptive approach, right? Sort of, we are going to come in and we're going to tell you the best way to be, and, you know, World Bank loans, IMF initiatives have all these extra stigma, which I personally don't necessarily disagree with, right? In principle, I want women to have more rights, more opportunity. But it's this sort of almost...
Am I forced to say, well, thank you for that generosity?
Yeah, but you know what I mean? Sort of thing, you know what I mean? The condescending approach to it. And that's why a lot of African nations really like the Chinese, because they just come in. They don't give a shit about your human rights. They don't give a shit about your...
Oh, they really like the Chinese because the Chinese don't come in and make demands from them.
They
just take 15 kilometers of beach.
Yeah, but what I'm saying, James, is like what they like the Chinese because, well, the government does. The people don't. But the governments do, because what do? They come in, they build the big infrastructure projects, which the governments or people who are in charge of African nations, which are not often the fairest elected ones, can then just sell to themselves and be like, hey, look what we managed to achieve. And it's like, you didn't do anything. You didn't employ local worker forcemen. The Chinese have not assimilated. There's no skill and knowledge transfer. So what I'm saying is that, you know, governments prefer the Chinese approach, but obviously people...
Well, they do until they can't make the payments, and then they find out that their brand spanking new airport now suddenly belongs to China, almost in a sovereign sense.
Yeah, for sure, and that's what I'm saying. So I agree both of you in that sense, right? I obviously want it to be more that women, and that was the second point I was going to make. Just to look at what actually happened to Afghanistan with the presence of the Americans. Forget the war side of it, just the economic development side of it. Women's economic opportunities exploded, women's contraceptive use and, you know, fertility rate decreased. It was so much more opportunity for women because they were granted these things through Western initiatives. But obviously that came with all the bullshit of the war and everything else that undermined it. And since they've left, well, it's all gone backwards. So yeah, I want that, but I'm realistic.
But this sort of affirms what you just said before. What you've been suggesting is the limited influence that these NGOs have. You know, James and I work on Southeastern Europe, and pick your capital. What do you want, Pristina or Sarajevo? You can't go more than 10 meters without running into an NGO office. I think it contributes a major portion of the economy in both Bosnia and in the territory of Kosovo. And how effective really are they? Most of these NGOs will have maybe 3, 4, 5 people at most. You know, they're funded by some kind of trust fund. You get a conference that's offered maybe once every 6 months or so, a couple of articles that are posted about how it's all Serbia's fault, and repeat the process. Ultimately, when we talk about the effectiveness of an organization like USAID, you have on one level people saying, well, it's a waste of taxpayers' money, which we've come to conclude that if you want a waste of taxpayers' money, take a look at how much money we are just blindly giving to, Israel, or how much we're just throwing into the military. That is a waste of taxpayers' money as far as I'm concerned, right? USAID is little more than throwing pocket change around just to make it look like we're somewhat philanthropic.
Well, I mean, what does it come to? It came to what? It was about $44 billion last year as compared to the defense budget, which came in at almost 900 billion.
Yeah, I mean, we're approaching
$1
trillion. We're approaching $1 trillion thing. I mean, there's just, so, I mean, if you really want to talk about what we do as far as soft power is concerned, I mean, look, I just came from Central Asia. I spent 3.5 years living there. And the big question is, how influential is a country like the United States? Minimal. I would even say the European Union has more of an influence at this point. In countries like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. I mean, OSCE still has a mission in Bishkek, which I'm surprised at. I know the people who work there; they're quite fine people. I mean, American influence within the region rarely goes beyond soft power consumerism and a couple of special universities and places of higher learning. Beyond that, the major influential powers within the region are, Russia, which has never left, China, which is sort of seen as the wave of the future. Turkey certainly has an influence there. Iran is now pivoting towards Central Asia as well. So, when it comes to U.S. influence, and I know that, the narrative likes to make it look like the U.S. is changing the hearts and minds and, instilling the sense of liberalism within the society. If they can get anywhere from 500 to 1,000 people to believe that stuff, I mean, that's a major victory. And at the end of the day, take a look at how effective have these NGOs been in Bosnia for over 30 years, in Kosovo. I mean, the Bosnia is still a dysfunctional state. Kosovo is run by a maniacal xenophobic nationalist. So, I mean, what is it that you're hoping to accomplish?
I think there is there's this argument or whatever dichotomy of sort of, you want to believe that these NGOs, or I don't like to label all of them, but a large proportion of them, you can argue, have this sort of idealistic approach to come in, but there's also a degree of saviorism that comes with that, right? This whole idea of white saviorism in Africa, which is quite a left-leaning idea that sort of white people still come in to sort of educate the people in Africa, even though they're pretty well educated. I like to define it more specifically as economic development, not social development, because they have their own customs, which are different to Western ones. And I think it's this approach, which again is more what makes China quite appealing, or even the Russians. The Russians, they come in, they do the job. They don't go on about too much about values. Again, I personally do think Western values or democracy is the best form of government, but not every country wants democracy necessarily, or Western style democracy. Mm-hmm. They quite like China's model, this, weird hybrid model. Some of them like a strongman centralized thing because they think, well, if we constantly have elections, then we're going to have economic uncertainty every time there's a new party in power. And so we prefer someone like a Putin or something that, at least we've got less freedom, but we've got more economic stability. I get the argument for sure. It's not necessarily my personal.
To your point.
I can buy into that argument, but only in limited ways.
Really? The liberal on the show?
No. You don't listen to what I have to say. I was always struck. I remember the first time I went to Singapore. And I remember thinking, I've always said Singapore will bring out your inner right winger. This is a society where political freedoms are limited, social freedom is limited, but you're free to be as wealthy as you want to be. And it's very alluring. And I could see the argument if these societies were doing wonderfully well economically, but they're not. And I've often thought about it. It's something maybe, Michael, you're aware of a literature on this, but, I've often thought that, in any given situation, if you are to be repressive, you've got to give people an outlet of some sort.
Yes.
So if you talk about political, economic, or social freedoms and repression, one of those has got to be open. And Singapore is a really interesting example of where they've gone for the economic.
Yeah.
And you can go down, and it is a heartland of consumerism. Yeah. Dubai is exactly the same. It's marketed. It said you can. consume as much as you like. You're absolutely free to do that, but you're not going to get democracy here.
Yeah.
And there are going to be fairly rigid rules about what you can do. But go ahead, knock yourself off. You can eat at the best restaurants. You can buy the fanciest cars.
Yep. Welcome to Central Asia. Welcome to Central Asia 2.0. This is exactly it. I was going to say, to your point earlier, Pyotr, about Namibia, about Russia, China having some kind of strategic edge. The United States' influence is minimal. Look, let's be honest. America's influence in Africa is minimal just because it's Africa. I mean, we just don't give it the time and attention that it deserves. But what I was saying before about, if Russian foreign policy has a soft power, if it has something, and it's hard to put your thumb on, it's this idea that it operates in constant antithesis to that of the West. But it assumes that Western foreign policy, and even more specifically, like American foreign policy, British, UK, EU foreign policy, comes with political strings attached. We'll invest in your country, but you need to stop beating up the gays. We'll invest in your country, but you have to empower women. We'll do this, but you have to do it. China basically comes in and says, we'll invest in your country, period. Yeah, we're going to own a good chunk of the territory, but we're going to invest in your country. You still want to beat up the gays? Go right ahead. You still want to disavow any notion of transgender identity? Go right ahead. And to James's point, this is a type of, it's funny, James, how you brought up Singapore, because there's so many times when I was in Central Asia and so many people were like, oh, if only we could be like Singapore. And I'm like, Uzbekistan is a country approaching 40 million people. Singapore is a business park. Okay. I mean, sort of calibrate your enthusiasm here for a moment here. I mean, ultimately what you're going for is the Chinese corporatist model, which has in the last, 30 or some odd years, proven to be successful. Dengism has proven successful, and that is we can liberalize the economy as long as we maintain a monopoly on political power. And this is ultimately what we see in many of these developing countries, and that is consumerism absolutely at your disposal. Spend your money like it's like no tomorrow. Go to Dubai. Have no problem going. In fact, if you can't even go to Dubai, make Dubai in your own country. There are plenty parts of Tashkent that I have seen the Dubaiification of, where it is just all glitz and bling. And if you have the money, you can live a good life. This is the sort of the subliminal ideology. And that is, who cares about political rights and civil liberties? Forget the fact that there is a political form of patronalism that runs these countries. And forget the fact that they all stem from the old Soviet model. The idea is that you can live like any good middle class if you don't talk about politics, don't talk about human rights, and just live your own life. And this works for many people, right? Sam Huntington, in his book, Third Wave, mentioned this term. I think it was almost a throwaway term, but I use it constantly in my courses. It's called performance legitimacy. Right. And if any of my students are listening in right now, they know exactly what I'm about to talk about. Right. Performance legitimacy is a fantastic way for people that run a political monopoly at the top can oftentimes buy consent. And that is every so often the public is going to become restless because the status quo is no longer tenable. So what do the authorities do? They provide more economic reforms. They do something in the form of consumerism. Here's a new shopping mall. If you're happy, fantastic. You're not happy? My bad. Here's 2 shopping malls. Here you go. Oh, look, we just updated the airport. We now can import stuff from Europe or the United States tax-free, tariff-free. You don't have to drive old Soviet-era cars anymore. Look at this, BYD. State-of-the-art stuff here. And I'm going to be honest with you, spending time in Tashkent, in Almaty, in Dushanbe, of all places, Dushanbe is transforming literally overnight. And that's not saying, anything about Bishkek, which in and of itself is this fantastic hybrid of this, old, smoggy Soviet industrial city with 4 5-star hotels here. And for the most part, the general population has come to the conclusion, they haven't said this openly, but they've come to the conclusion that if life is good, and if, I can make money, buy a house, buy a car, live better than the previous generation can, then who do I care runs the country? What do I care if there's no political opposition going around? And that's not to say that these countries should be liberal democracies. It's to say that the idea of liberal democracy today is, in many parts of the developing world, just not really a necessary option, right? And if you believe in the tenets of liberal democracy, you realize that, you know, the Chinese, more than anybody else, have figured out an angle over this. And yes, for countries like Sudan or South Africa or Nigeria or, you know, Kazakhstan, whatever it is, it's much more prudent for them to take the investment opportunities from China or Russia while maintaining this monopoly on political power. You know, I'll finish up with just this other thing. You know, teaching at at Webster University, it's American University in Tashkent, I was never censored on anything that I could talk about. There was no monitoring, there was no nothing. We were given full academic freedom. I did not change any of my curriculum from American-oriented courses here. And there were just two things we couldn't talk about. Two things we just could not. One, don't criticize the current government. Okay, fine, no problem there. And two, don't make an agenda about the gays. Like, that's what they are really, really fixed on. Said, all right, I mean, I'm teaching political theory. I'm teaching about the relationship between capitalism, Marxism, and nationalism. I don't know where I'm going to fit the LGBTQ movement in, but okay, fine, no problem. I don't care about that. You know, it's like, whatever. This is my opinion, bigger things to talk about here. But other than that, right, I was given full freedom to speak and say, not just me, but anyone else within that setting. And I guess the reason behind it is that, once again, performance legitimacy wants to show, hey, look, we have a private university. It's an American accredited university where, you know, it is not state operated. When students go there, we're talking about some of the best, I have some of the most brilliant students I've had in years attend this university. But a lot of them also realize that once they've graduated, right, they're entering into a larger framework within the country that is controlled and monopolized by a different type of socio-political clientele. And they know this, right? They absolutely know this. So stay home, live a good life, and conform to the system. Or if you would like something else, apply to grad school, go live abroad elsewhere. The state has no problem. Do svidaniya, пока, с Богом, have fun.
All right. Well, there ends the Michael Rossi rant segment of our show. No, I'm just teasing you, mate. No, I think I was listening to a really good episode of the Politics is the Rest is Politics with Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart here in the UK. Not always my favorite, not that I agree with everything, but they had a really good segment about China and its backyard vis-a-vis Central Asia. And that is something that I think would be worth talking about, because there's a lot of parallels between Namibia, Mongolia, Central Asia, because these are huge states. Well, Kazakhstan, 20 million. It's the 9th largest country in the world by territory. Huge, sparseness there. So very much worth talking about in terms of how these countries are being leveraged by the greater powers in their respective ways. I do think that education formats, like in universities, is quite an effective method. And I do think the American method like that is more effective, say, as an example, than purely NGOs that are there for a certain agenda. There was a good comment, I believe, again, by Elise. Yeah, this one I think is quite a good one. Elise has been making some great comments today, but like more sense for aids to focus on food and small business support rather than maybe more controversial social issues, which could be more divisive. Maybe focus purely on the sort of more just quantitative economics. But anyway, I really wanted to hear your guys' thoughts about Trump and the National Guard. I mean, we could talk about Ukraine as well. I don't know, but I feel like...
Well, I think we do need to talk about Ukraine. But I mean, certainly, from my perspective, the news that Trump was... I'm not sure what the latest is, has sort of national, well, there are some elements, don't there? There seems to be. But what was interesting was the LAPD put out a statement talking, and very, very specifically using peaceful about peaceful protests. So it was clearly the LAPD was actually trying to get the message across that whatever's been done here to try and present these as violent insurrection, which sort of somehow necessitated the role of not even paramilitary forces, was just nonsense. I mean, and it did say, look, we are also keeping an eye on the situation. If anything happens, it's our responsibility to protect the society and things like that. But it made that very, very clear point that this was about politics playing out. And I think it is incredibly disturbing. And Michael, I mean, now you're back in the States. I mean, it just really, really, everything that we've seen with Trump, and it's going to be the Trump derangement syndrome comments in the timeline, which is not because like you, I mean, it's with a background in political science. I mean, what we're seeing in the States in any other context, and we would be saying that this is absolutely the march, not just to authoritarianism, but fascist authoritarianism.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there's people have made enough similarities already to ICE agents with brown shirts, with the paramilitary organization,
face covered,
with the dystopian face covered thing as well. Yeah. I mean, it's right out of sci-fi. It is just right.
And then to have Republican, representatives and senators saying, "Oh no, this is all normal." In fact, it's so normal, we're going to pass legislation that makes it illegal for you to identify who these people are. This is secret police territory, and yet you have a whole swathe of American society that spent decades sort of screaming blue murder at Democrats doing anything which is going to infringe on American, freedoms, just simply lapping this up, which of course exposes the hypocrisy. They were never about freedom. They were always about control, but control under their terms.
No, it's control on their terms, but and I don't even know. I don't even know where to begin. I don't even know where to begin with this. First, by saying I'm not surprised by any of it. I'm really not surprised by any of it. But the thing that strikes me is that there have been demonstrations against ICE for years. This is not a new thing. This took place under Biden, under Trump, and previously under Obama. Okay? So in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't matter whether the White House is run by a Democrat or a Republican. But the security sector has been the one element of this country that both parties undeniably invest time, money, and resources into. Which, when a Democrat is in power, it's less scrutinized. When a Republican is in power, oh my God, it's the slippery slope to fascism. The second thing is that it's also not a surprise that most of, not all, but most of these ICE raids are taking place in the major urban sectors of the United States. New York, LA, Chicago, they're all run by Democrats, which the Republican Party is, not surprisingly, using as its narrative, right? Number one, the Democrats are weak on illegal immigration. They're weak on crime. This wouldn't happen in Republican-controlled states, which, okay, most Republican-controlled states are in the center of the country. Aside from urban areas, you don't have this happen.
And of course, there's no illegal immigrants working in meatpacking in Republican states.
This is the other thing that I have to say. Let's forget that one of the big reasons for illegal immigration isn't because everybody is still intoxicated with the American dream, but that there are companies and jobs that will hire them, that will pay them under the table. I mean, this is the biggest thing. I mean, if you really want to go after this whole notion of illegal immigration, go after the companies that, many of them are Republican leaning. Why? Because they don't have to pay tax on these people. They are absolutely exploitable. It is all about the bottom dollar. But, fuck me for bringing that up.
Well, Michael, if I can interject on that point, just a couple of things, because I was in Washington for the best part of 5 years, right? Part of that was the Trump administration. Part of that was Biden. Now, I was there under both when ICE was utilized, firstly, for the insurrection, secondly, for the inauguration, thirdly, for Black Lives Matter, but also at the end of 2019. There were, well, it's DC, there's always flare-ups, right? And I will never forget, I lived in DuPont Circle, so about 10 minutes northwest of the White House, near Lafayette Square, just down Connecticut Avenue. For those of you in America, there's DC's broken up into 4 quadrants. The capital is the center, and the northwest is the most sort of, well, what we know of. White House, the mall with Lincoln Memorial, and I lived in that area. And Trump called in the National Guard at least twice during my time there. And I have a lot of buildings in DC, downtown DC, have rooftops with pools or whatever, deck chairs or whatever sort of thing. I'll never forget, I've got a video of it somewhere on my phone, of a helicopter, National Guards, circling, and my entire laptop and like bag flying off because they were circling above it. The gust of the thing just over the balcony onto the street below. But the point I'm making is that they really did pull in the National Guard when they felt that they were in a sense of like panic or reaction. Mm-hmm. And I think what's happening at the moment, I'm not going to pretend I'm an expert on events right now, all of it. But what I'm seeing is it reminds me of what I've seen before, which is that simply in his first term, Trump was reactionary. He wasn't sure what he was doing, right? And he had a lot of people around him who were better placed to advise him of how to do things. Now he's got a much clearer approach. And why I'm saying this is because the rate at which the National Guard have been deployed and mobilized illustrates that he was clearly expecting some kind of fight from this and almost wanted this fight. He was at the football game or whatever, the basketball, I don't know. He was at a sports game, right? And he did that. From there, he activated it. Mm-hmm. So it shows to you he's a lot more assertive. He's a lot more willing to go to this. But also, he really has that strongman tendency, which is why I included it in the title, at least for my video. He, it's going to be his birthday soon, right? He's getting tanks to DC to do a parade around DC. What is this? This is Putin's Russia. This is North Korea. This guy, he wants to be one of these people. And his reaction to I'm not saying I support the rioters necessarily. I don't know enough about the context again. Is this strongman, hard way? Even if, as James rightly said, and you have said yourself, Michael, right? There are legit. Last point. Sorry, just entertainment, right? Technically speaking, the biggest proportion of people who are illegal immigrants, not undocumented or smuggled, which is different. Like there's different classifications in migration. I know that's what I studied. Illegal migrants, technically, the biggest proportion of them are simply people who overstay their visas or are going from visa to visa. I was one, technically, for a day. I was an illegal immigrant because I was changing my job from the International Crisis Group to the World Bank. And so I had to change the classification of visa. So technically, I was an illegal alien, right? Mm-hmm. They make up the biggest proportion of illegal migrants based on statistics. The people that you're seeing in LA and all this sort of stuff are scapegoats often. But there is a problem with mass migration, that being said. I also do agree with some people on the right who say that.
It's the perfect storm in the sense that I always reference this book just because I think it was just written at the right time, and it is still very, very relevant today. Thomas Frank's "What's the Matter with Kansas," which I recommend everybody to take a look at. It was written in 2004, which ultimately the question is, why is it that so many white Americans, white middle American Republicans, why do they vote Republican? Why do they vote against their socioeconomic interest? And the short answer to that is the Republican Party has managed to corner the market on the sociocultural. We tend to forget that and me being the only, Native American citizen here, since the early 1990s, conservative talk radio, Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity, Fox News, they have been operating relatively uninterrupted, creating this ceaseless narrative of us versus them, right? The patriotic true Americans versus the ones who hate the country. And there's no element to it besides there are people, the ones that are protesting against ICE, the ones that are throwing rocks at ICE vans and ICE vehicles are being demonized in the same way that the Palestinians are being demonized in Gaza and West Bank, right? Us versus them. The law-abiding citizens versus the anarchists. the radical leftists, the Marxists. I actually wish that my country had as much radical Marxism in its country as every right-wing Fox News watching uncle's member in their family says that it was. We'd actually be able to get shit accomplished, okay? We can't even get past figuring out what praxis we want for, our weekly book chat or whatever it is, right? But Trump is also somebody who, you said before, and there was a question, how come Trump is not engaging in countries like Haiti or other areas around the world? Doesn't do anything for him, right? What Trump wants, and this is why I said before, that's exactly it, right? Trump is unbelievably easy to figure out, right? I don't know why people think that, he's an enigma. Trump is unbelievably easy, okay? He's an egotistical, collapsing narcissist. Not a full collapse narcissist, but he's a collapsing narcissist. He loves ego. I mean, the two people on the planet that figured him, actually three, up until, three recently. Elon is already going off doing his own thing. But like two other people around the world that absolutely know how to play Trump, Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. Just stoke his ego, and that's it. I heard somebody say that, Trump is like Putin or Xi Jinping. I think that's an insult to both Putin and Xi Jinping, both of whom are well ensconced within a larger security framework that they represent. Trump is just Trump. I mean, Trump is kind of like, I remember this, there was, James, you might remember this also from newsreels or whatever. What was it, 1974, Nicolae Ceausescu and his wife Elena go to Pyongyang, and they're given the typical North Korean greeting. And the two of these little peasants from Romania, they love this stuff. And they're like, I've never felt more important in my life. I'm going to have this in Romania. This is what ultimately Romanian communism turned into, this type of sultanistic cult of personality state. This is what Trump wants, right? Trump just simply wants to become the face of American patriotism, which, if it requires, sending in the National Guard, sending in the tanks to stick it to the liberals, the lefties, the radicals, the anarchists, the Marxists, the Bolsheviks, the whatever it is, right? He's going to do it. And it's absolutely fantastic, as far as he's concerned, that Gavin Newsom is, against this. Because what does it then show within his narrative, within his circle? That Newsom is siding with the protesters, that they are enemies of America, right? Isn't this fantastic? Forget the fact that ICE operated under Newsom's orders prior to this. Forget the fact that ICE rounds up people along with full cooperation with NYPD in New York City. Everybody thinks that New York City is this den of, liberalism. I like to say NYPD stands for knock your punk ass down, okay? That you have videos of them literally tackling people to the ground for hopping a turnstile, and people are jacking off to this because law and order is going to be restored. Which, mind you, right, in less than a month, we're going to be celebrating a holiday where we absolutely go nuts over the fact that we've rebelled against authority and tyranny, and we're all about, freedom and liberty, and yet we will deep throat the security sector every other day of the year.
So, James, you were losing your mind when I said the tanks thing, and I know you were also what Michael was saying just now. Like, how do you look at this? Because
apart from anything else, somebody pointed out a very good point that it's going to cost a lot of money to fix the roads after those tanks have been on it. I don't know if you've ever seen what a tank does to an ordinary road. It chews it up. The States is not terribly well known for the quality of its roads at the best of times. But
you can't say that coming from the UK, mate. Have you seen ours? I don't know how they own cycles.
Yeah, well, that may be the case, but I don't think we're in the habit of doing sort of bloody great parades with sort of like tanks. Although I was very aware of the irony of railing against it when we've got Trooping the Colour next week, which is a military parade in honour of the King or Queen's birthday. But that's our system of hereditary monarchs, and so that's what we do. But the States is meant to be built on something very, very different. So the idea that you've got a bloody great military parade with tanks and everything that is all for Trump's ego. I mean, look, I just don't understand it. And I know there's a few MAGA who watch and everything like that. I mean, how do you square this in your mind that what Trump is doing is everything that you've spent years telling everyone that, you know, the tyranny that America fights against, this is why we've got to have guns so that we don't have a dictator. And then you've got somebody now who literally is dictating orders day in, day out via, you know, these executive orders, hardly using Congress. If you can't, you know, that really pretty much sums up the term dictator. And yet seems to be perfectly acceptable. It's just utterly, just as an outsider looking in on it. And yet,
I think James, for me, one of the things is
to really grasp the magnitude of this problem.
Well, one of my favorite things, and I am going to do a small plug right now because it's pretty cool, but I'll be hosting Martin Wolf, chief economics correspondent of the Financial Times, in about a month. And I think it was him, or was it someone else, one of his colleagues at FT, they coined this whole TACO thing, right? Trump, what's it stand for?
Always chickens out.
Yeah. I love that. It's so good. And it shows you the fragility he has as a mind, right? That when a person asks him, he gets so defensive and all that. It just, and to be honest, Mike, I completely agree with you. It was me who said that, and it is an insult to Putin and Xi as actual strongmen, because Trump is nowhere near actually going to be. He's a wannabe one. He wants to be one, which is why he's going to try and hold a parade in DC and destroy the roads with tanks. Right? It's just too farcical to even begin to properly, I think, comprehend. And I just, you know, one wonders how far he's going to go. And this sort of leads me to what we wanted to touch upon, I think, for the last little bit of our chat, is, you know, his support to Ukraine. Because from my understanding, you know, he's getting fed up with the negotiations. He's largely indifferent to what's happened. I'm pretty sure that the Ukrainians were informing the Americans in the 18 months up to Operation Spiderweb. They were informing the Biden administration of their plans or some ideas that they're having, things they're looking at. As soon as Trump takes office, I'm pretty sure they cut all that communication out, to be honest with you, because Trump would have just told Putin, right? So I think but what's interesting is the longer that the Kremlin continues to try to play mind games with the US, that's just pissing off Trump. And I think that ultimately he's just going to give up, but he's also not going to impede. He's not going to try to stop support for Ukraine, but he's not going to do anything to inhibit Congress or others from supporting it, right? I think he's just going to, or you think that you disagree with that, Jen?
Yeah, I mean, because I really do think that it, you know, and I think people who say Trump just simply takes the view of the last person he talked to, with every passing week, we've seen that that's more and more the case. Literally, he will have a conversation with Zelensky in private, and then suddenly for a few days, he'll say something which is a little bit pro-Ukrainian. And then it's, you know, and
yeah,
I think that whole thing about being angry with Putin, now he seems to be sort of saying that, suggesting that what Ukraine did was somehow equal to what Russia has been doing. One, in terms of invading the country, but two, Russia is attacking civilian targets the whole time. It's bombing Ukrainian cities, and then Ukraine takes this action against, you know, Russian strategic bombers. And but you know, that's somehow equivalent. You know, these clear military targets.
Sure, I don't disagree with you.
Absolutely. You know, there is no logic to
the point I'm trying to make, James, is more along the lines of, if Trump's just going to want to wash his hands of the whole war entirely and just be, you know, basically he's not going to try to stop things passing through Congress. I mean, at least has made a good point that the White House is tacitly pressuring Congress to turn down the sanctions. So maybe they are. It's more that they won't. Do you know what I mean?
You know what I think's happened that has changed a lot of the rhetoric that we're seeing from the United States recently, especially over Europe, is I think it has finally dawned on them that all this anti-European talk was just simply leading Europe to say, fine, we'll do things on our own and we'll stop buying US defense equipment. And the enormity of this has probably hit home. And, you know, I've made videos on this. I've talked about this, that this was incredibly short-sighted, that the current administration Just Trump did not have the wherewithal to understand that, yes, US presidents have long complained about Europe not pulling its weight on defense, but that was exactly what the United States wanted. It kept Europe as a protectorate, and it said to Europe that, listen, seeing as we're having to provide the bulk of your security, you've got to make sure that your equipment is wherever possible interoperable with us. Best way to do that, buy American. And then when Trump starts saying,
are you sure that's hitting home though? Because Trump.
Why do we suddenly see Vance saying? There's two things. Vance suddenly started talking nice to Europeans and saying, yes, they are our partners. And the other thing now you're seeing, which is the giveaway on it, is now the US is saying we want it to be 5% of income. We want you spending 5% of your GDP on defense. And saying that that is something they know that Europeans won't be able to do, and it's just saying. So I think if Ukraine is in a better position now with the Americans, it's because Europe has made it very clear that United States, if you don't want to take Ukraine's side, we will continue to do it, and we will continue in our own way, and that means building up our own defense industries. And not only will that mean lots and lots of lost contracts for the United States, but don't rely on us for support in other areas where you might need it. And I think that after all that bluster at the start of the Trump administration, maybe they're starting to get the message, because Europe has spoken bluntly
on this point, James, because I said I'd touch upon the Polish election, and here we go. I'm making a video on this as well because I think it's quite an interesting angle to explore. But like, Trump is trying to find, on the administration more broadly, at least in some minds, is trying to find ways to influence the election. So we've had the Romanian one that didn't go well for the candidate that they wanted,
and the Polish one. Let's remember, only just
but it's still only just. But in democracy, it doesn't matter, mate.
Well, and Poland also. Let's also, before we get too excited about this, remember that Poland is a prime ministerial system. So, in fact, yes, it can make life difficult. It's not great as a sign, but let's not get too excited about. It wasn't as close. I think and for every Poland, you said Romania. We can point to Canada. We can point to Australia, and frankly, the United States. Those are pretty serious losses in terms of seeing how other forces have done because of what Trump's done. But the Trump effect is working more against the United States than in its favor at the moment.
You are hard to break into.
Oh yeah, of course.
You can't negate the fact there is still a populist remnants here, whether or not it was close.
Nobody's denying that.
In Poland?
Nobody's denying that, but Poland has its specificities that we know is quite strong.
And the thing about Poland is whether it's Law and Justice or I forget the name of the other party, but Law and Justice won again. I mean, even the most right-wing, conservative, populist Polish government is still going to be anti-Russian, pro-EU, pro-NATO. The only difference is that one party is just going to be much more vocal about saying the people that committed genocide against our own people in the 1940s were Ukrainians, right? That's it.
I get that, guys. But the point I'm making
Poland is pretty solid.
Trump still has mechanisms that he can try to pull to. It may not win in Europe. But the biggest concern I have, and I think we're on the same page here, maybe we're just approaching it. The main emphasis I'm saying is that Trump can still find ways to undermine the European project as a whole, right? What does Europe
and Russia can as well, which is the big concern here. And this is why a lot of Europeans are saying we've got to wake up to this. But I think that the United States is dialing back its rhetoric. I think it has woken up to what
I hope it has. I'm just saying that tacitly they may still try to fiddle where they can. Look at what's happened in the Netherlands with Geert Wilders' coalition breaking down. The Trump administration are definitely going to try to fiddle there, right? It maybe not fix the election, but this is the point, right? It's interference in a new format that we wouldn't have used to have seen in previous US administration. I obviously want to agree with you, James, that they are dialing it back and hopefully they've woken the hell up. That insulting your allies of yesteryear is probably not the best way to go about it.
Or allies are still meant to be when they're buying equipment.
No, for sure. I think Europeans
have hit on what Trump is, in that sense, what he's about. He's about making money and everything. And this was a huge loss for the United States. And I'm sure that there were a lot of defense industries straight on the phone to the White House saying, listen, they're going to start canceling orders any day now, if not already doing it.
Sure. No, 100%. I'm not. We're not disagreeing.
I'm not saying that there's been a road to Damascus conversion for the Trump administration. They like the Europeans.
Wait, what did you say?
Because people like Vance clearly don't.
Now,
I go to what?
There's a pragmatism that's kicked in, and I think that pragmatism feeds through to Ukraine.
Wait, back up. What did you say? Road to Damascus conversion?
Yes.
What is that in reference to Syria and the whole change in the state?
No. Don't you remember Sunday school?
No, it's a reference. It's a biblical reference to Saint Paul,
okay, I'm too young for that.
who persecuted Christians, and then suddenly became very.
Yeah, James,
sorry,
I'm with you on that one.
yeah,
I was with you on that one. I got it. Yeah.
And so I'm not saying that Vance is suddenly a great friend of the Europeans and he sees them. No, but
no,
he sees.
That's just my age.
No, it's not your age. Pyotr, that it's I'm not going to ask what school you went to.
Well, I mean, it was
that's a basic, So a biblical reference there, which the Marxists in our club got. But anyway,
I like the fact that many people in the comment sections they all went to Sunday school. Those of you in the comment sections, good for you guys. All right,
they did actually. There's a lot of them. Acts 9,
good.
The road to Gaza, the road to Damascus. Okay. Okay. Anyway, so you guys were going on, but no, I just mean, the point I'm trying to make is it's not that I disagree with you. I just worry that the Trump administration will still try to find ways that it can.
But I don't think our two views are necessarily contradictory to each other. I think that, but what I'm saying is that completely antagonistic approach, openly antagonistic approach that Vance and people were taking towards Europe now seems to be given way by the fact that, Hegseth is being difficult. He didn't go to the latest NATO meeting on Ukraine, which is a very worrying sign. But suddenly they're talking about 5% defense expenditure. That's going to be the loyalty test. Mm-hmm. And that's going to be the way that, they're basically, this is Trump just doing his shakedown tactic with Europe, saying, we'll be your friends. Give us the money
no one's actually going to meet 5%. The Polish are the highest at 4.5. The Americans are at what? 1.8? The Americans are just
so that goes. I suppose then there's the theory that then they're going to suddenly, use this to flounce out of NATO. But again, I think when the money is when they see the money on the table, that what this will mean.
I'm just sorry, the comment below. Tom's saying the gloves are off. So the gloves are off, guys. I'm ready. Are you ready?
The gloves are off. The only time that we got confrontational, as I think, was just James and myself's incredulity that you had no idea what road to Damascus was.
It was a Syria reference. Yes. No. I mean, don't worry, Pyotr. It was an age thing, obviously.
Yes.
The standards of education, Michael. It's terrible with this next generation, isn't it? It's really something that's flipped.
Kids these days,
Yeah, but we were getting the same for not knowing.
Well, okay. So let's sort of pivot back to this whole.
Well, actually, hang on. If I tilt my camera up,
Pyotr's got to get back in.
Look what's there in the top right corner, right? That's a Christian. So I am in Italy after all, right? I'm just down the road from the Vatican. So I have my religious.
I was thinking your setup today is looking rather nice and posh.
Yeah,
I mean, I'm just outside Rome in my family's villa, so we're here for a few. Because I just got back from Namibia. I was in London for a few days. I had no internet, so I was staying at a friend's whole weekend. So this is like the traveling.
Where are you?
I'm in Italy, Rome.
Yeah, but where are you staying? I know, not the name of it, in a hotel or
family's villa. It's well, look at the lamp. It's very old Italian, isn't it? Anyway, what do you guys think about Spiderweb? I really wanted to have your takes on just this remarkable operation. And I think the illustration of just how, one, bad Russian intelligence and security is of its borders, but two, the remarkable aptness of the Ukrainians for this. Some people are calling it Mission Impossible, James Bond-esque, incredible stuff, right?
It made a headline, and certainly the Russian Telegram channels were initially very, very critical of the Russian security network, saying how could Russia allow this to happen? But beyond that, Ukraine is still losing a village, a town in the eastern and now the Sumy regions every other day. The military operation has not really slowed down in any bit, and everyone is expecting, if Russia has not yet retaliated, they're going to. So it made a splash. I think it shows that Ukraine is living up to the first line of its anthem. Ukraine is not yet dead, but I don't see how this is really that much of a game changer.
Really?
No.
What, the fact that it's not a third of its strategic bombing fleet?
I was going to say, they literally cannot replace
Seriously, in all sorts of ways. All right. I think it's a significant. All right. Maybe Michael's right. It's not going to suddenly, we're not going to see the front line collapse.
No,
but it is a very, very significant move, and it's incredibly embarrassing. There's no doubt about it.
That I will give. Absolutely.
Putin must be absolutely livid about this.
Yes.
Well, he disappeared.
What he's going to do in response? Is this really now all out?
Well, Michael, as the sort of the Rousseau guy, as much as anyone, you and I have agreed often that when times are hard, right? We did our live stream before. I think me and you were starting to collaborate, James, back in 2023, about a week after the Wagner mutiny, right? Do you remember we did that live stream, Michael?
Yep.
And we both agreed when things actually get really bad for Putin, he just disappears. I recently had Jason J. Smart of the Kiev Post on, and we agree with that as well. Like, when shit really is bad, he just disappears. He there's no statements, there's no presence, there's no reassurance from the head of state. He just disappears. Would you say that's right, or it's more complex?
So the most recent video that I had translated, which was about a day or two ago, was Putin's first official response to a series of things. First was the initial assessment of the ceasefire talks in Istanbul, with the agreement between the Russian and the Ukrainian side to exchange prisoners of war and bodies, which in the last couple of days, from what we've heard, the Ukrainian side has not delivered on that. The Russian side is coming up with its own reasons and explanations. But what was more is about the fallout, not just with the strategic targeting of the airfields, but also the railway system in Bryansk, which was talked about more than the airfields, because that was considered to be, as far as Russia was concerned, an act of terrorism, because a civilian train was bombed. And yes, there's been a lot of times where, as you said, when things happen, Putin gets quiet. This is how he operates. In the same way that the Ukrainian side was all insulted that Putin didn't show up to the Istanbul talks himself. Guys, Putin's been in power for 25 years. If you haven't figured out how he operates now, you better start paying attention. He calculates every single action that he takes. This is not in defense. This is not to condemn. This is just simply to point out. He takes a day or two to assess what had happened before he says something, which, of course, in 24-hour, 7-day-a-week news, social media, everybody says something. Or we give the first 24 to 48 hours to Dmitry Medvedev to be as creative as possible on Twitter. He sort of shouts and screams and spittles as he's texting. Putin is very calm and very calculating. The whole Wagner thing, which, we talked about, what was it, about a year ago, 2 years ago. I didn't see Putin at once get nervous. I knew from the start that this was going to be an absolute failed mutiny when there were no other elements within the Russian Ministry of Defense that came to Prigozhin's aid. So, I mean, this was, performance more than anything else. As far as the fallout from the Ukrainian attack, I absolutely agree with James that if nothing else, this is an embarrassment. This is a black eye for Russia, especially how far into Russian territory Ukraine was able to achieve this, which means that, I mean, you're not flying the drones from Ukraine. You are coordinating. This is inside Russian territory, which is probably more of a red flag to me than anything else, because this means that they have cooperation on the ground, right, within Russia. Now, whether these are just willing dupes or whether these are collaborators, sort of remains to be seen. When I say it's not that much of a game changer is because it's, all of a sudden people think that, Russia's on the verge of collapse, that there's going to be an internal uprising. I'm like, look, guys, when you are getting close to reclaiming your 1991 borders, then, then have something to say. But until that time, it's performative at best.
Interesting.
Embarrassing, yes. Embarrassing, yes. No question about that. Does it show that Ukraine still has the fight in it? Absolutely so. I think what it also shows us is that even in light of negotiated ceasefires, there's going to be very much a shadow war that will take place between the two countries, even afterwards. What Ukraine cannot achieve on the battlefield, they can try to whittle away within Russian territory. But we also have to take into, and this is the last thing I'll hand this over to James here, is that if you truly believe that Ukraine was able to do this by itself without NATO coordination or without NATO consent, welcome to this whole Ukraine-Russia conflict. I'm glad that you're finally joining us after nearly 3 years.
Mr.
I mean, I
Kurzin?
think the bigger question in my mind, and again with the proviso that as I always say, I don't claim to be a military sort of expert, but
all right, moving on. So back to something
but looked at from a diplomatic. I mean, there's been a lot of talks. Are there going to be peace talks? And I think that what we've seen now is a very clear indication that seems incredibly unlikely for the summer. Yeah. I think Putin is saying now that he needs to get his revenge for this. There's been a lot of talks that now we're into June. This is really sort of fighting time. That Putin will try his luck over the course of the summer and hope something can change, and then maybe by the time we get to the autumn, then take a look at the lie of the land and see what's happening there. But it does seem highly unlikely now that obviously could be proven completely wrong tomorrow, but it doesn't seem likely that we're going to see any substantive peace talks over the summer, or even if they are taking place, it'll just be nodding their heads and just sort of trying to look as though they're doing something. If Trump really does seem to have the bit between the teeth in this still, but I that's I think the big thing I'd say, looking at what we've seen happening.
Yeah, I would say a couple of things, which is I've covered this quite a lot. I like Elise's point again. Elise, like, seriously, too many good comments. You just want to come on the show, like, seriously. No, but I think it did do more, right? It did reactivate a lot of interest among some Western nations, or revitalize the sense that Ukraine really does a lot with not as much. Sort of like we were talking about Russia's ability to extend its influence across spheres that we might not immediately think. Ukraine has this ability to sort of do, because also think about it, right? The argument amongst people who are really, really, really pro-Ukraine is that had the West or NATO or whatever given Ukraine everything from the beginning unrestrictedly, then this would have been even more different. But because sort of the Biden administration was opening the tap, but then closing it again, sort of, drip feeding, if that's the right term, HIMARS, javelins, then we got the rock, and it sort of got more and more, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't consistent enough to build a sort of decent defense plan or something like that. That's the argument that some people make. I personally think that's a little bit too simplified, because it is still the Russian Federation who just have a massive, much bigger army and a different approach to war, whether you agree with it or not. And I think that what Operation Spiderweb has demonstrated is that, number one, drones are even more of a asset and terrifying, if you want, component to modern warfare than we even thought already, right? Because what are nation states now looking at? They are realizing that they don't need to invest hundreds of billions or tens of billions of dollars in high-grade, advanced, complex machinery like strategic bombers. You need a bunch of drones, right? These drones were made from buy-off-the-shelf bits of equipment, and they were put and hired in lorries, and then they were driven. And they were striking as far into 4,000 kilometers away in Siberia.
Yep.
So I think
yes and no, Doctor. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, drones we can see, but remembering we're still looking at a war that's been fought over land, and it's those troops on the ground, it's the tanks that have got to go forward, which are actually taking the territory at the end of the day. So you're absolutely right. I mean, drones have absolutely revolutionized warfare, and it can be done in ways that are proving to be incredibly inventive. But we're still also seeing a conflict where we don't know exactly what the casualties are like on Ukraine side, but the estimates seem to be that it's coming in close to 1,000 troops a day. Russia.
No, I mean, I do want to be very clear, James, that what I'm saying about this is one specific operation. Strategically,
no, absolutely. But I think it's good to have the corrective that drones aren't going to win wars. Not in there, But sadly, I mean, I think if you said 5 years ago, people would have said that. But I think what we've seen with Ukraine is just a scary reminder.
What I think it does do is illustrate that we're going to see a reevaluation. Right, we just had the strategic defense review in the United Kingdom, right? And that was written. I think that was done by Fiona Hill and a couple of other well-known people about the threats that Putin poses, but also other adversaries around the world and stuff. What I'm making is more that bring full circle to our conversation about Africa, right? How instrumental are drones going to be in conflicts out there where they don't have, as soon as you can control the skies, even if it's with drones. The federal government in Ethiopia won the war against the TPLF or the Tagaru Front because they could control the skies. And they got that through drones from China, UAE, and Turkey, I believe, right? So that's more my point. But no, strategically speaking, Ukraine still has a manpower shortage. There is this inconsistency around how well they can hold the Eastern Front. To Michael's point, they are pushing and losing a lot of ground incrementally. The loss of Kursk is still a setback. Not sure how much it would have played into longer term peace. And overall, this summer, the peace talks are not going anywhere. I'm not even going to pretend to talk about that anymore. It's a joke. It's all performative. Yes, they're doing prisoner swaps, which is something, I guess, but no, this one operation is not going to bleed too far, I think, into the overall direction that the war is going, which is still, Ukraine is going to have to make some tough decisions, I think, and a lot of that depends on Europe and then obviously Trump. But anyway, that's all I wanted to say.
But also, I mean, it's quite possibly the case that Russia will also have to make some tough decisions, and we've been talked a lot about mobilization that Putin's held off on this, but or is he just simply going to say, right, I'll try and get as much as I can over the summer, and then by the time we get to autumn?
Well, the argument is, James and Michael, I'm curious for your thoughts given the Russian perspective you come from, which is, the main argument is that the war will not be decisively won until there is either, economic collapse or some kind of chaos in Russia, or the West completely just gives up on Ukraine and they just capitulate or something like that, right? It's not going to happen based on day-to-day fighting because it's just not speedy enough.
No, not unless there is some major ace in the hole that we do not know about that involves a major military offensive that takes Odessa or Kharkov or just goes right for Kiev. Again, you can look at what evidence exists on the ground and there can be some absolute outlier thing that nobody takes into account. I don't think that's going to happen. Realistically speaking, there's a couple of things here that I started thinking about. And as Putin was giving his response to the Ukrainian attacks, I mean, this helps him out as well, because whatever pressure might have been building on him for a ceasefire can now be thrown out the window.
Yes.
I mean, this is now be thrown out the window. I mean, it's look, states are not invulnerable. We tend to think, oh my God, I can't believe Russia was so stupid. I can't believe that they were this vulnerable. My God, what kind of a joke of a country is this? Well, I mean, we sat there on 9/11 thinking that everything was happy, hippie, hunky-dory until, oh shit, this keeps happening. So states are not this, this mythical entity that is able to withstand any and all attacks from the outside. And as far as the Russian narrative is, concerned, is that the Telegram channel, and there's multiple ones, right? The Telegram channels that aren't necessarily pro-Russian, but definitely give more of a Russian-based assessment of what's going on in Ukraine. They're very critical at times about what is happening in Russia. They're very critical about certain individuals. But the narrative, the explanation is that Russia has learned and adapted since 2002. In that the initial invasion, which saw Russia take a good chunk of territory in Ukraine's north. Remember, they came within distance of Kiev before they pulled back. And depending upon what side of the fighting you're on, it was either that Russia realized that they couldn't take Kiev, or that they decided to pull back in honor of some kind of negotiated assessment, which, again, once they think they come to an agreement with the West steps in and says to the Ukrainians, don't sign anything, keep on fighting. Whatever it happens to be, Russia is still there. And yes, they pulled out of Kherson. And yes, they pulled out of Izium. In this regard, I think it was overextension. Also because the Russian military just was not equipped to occupy that much territory of Ukraine. Since the failed counteroffensive about a year ago, I forget whether it's now a year, it's all a blur. I'm sorry, I don't have these numbers up in my head. But since the failed Ukrainian counteroffensive, Russia has just basically dug in and held its own, while very slowly chipping away at territory in Ukraine's east. And then now they've opened up a new front in Sumy. So I would not count... I would not count any prospects for an agreement. I absolutely agree with James right now, because no side is willing to. Russia does not have the capital now to force Ukraine to the negotiating table, and the proposals that Ukraine has are just beyond fanciful. I mean, at this stage of the game, I mean, Russia is under no pressure whatsoever to honor that. If they can come to some kind of an agreement about exchanging of prisoners and bodies, which they claim to have had, but now, Russia shows up to the border with Ukrainian bodies, and there's no Ukrainians to pick them up. So now there's all kinds of arguments about, because Ukraine doesn't want the bodies, because now they have to register them as dead as opposed to missing, and that requires the Ukrainian government to pay every family of a dead soldier 15 million hryvnias, which equals about $350,000 to $360,000. They don't have the money for that right now. So there's arguments in the narratives that are just going to continue to exacerbate both sides for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, as we probably, this is probably the last thing I wanted to touch on, so I'll probably share my final thoughts on it. But very simply from my perspective, I think there's a balancing act here of that. I want to recognize the successes when they occur, but also, make it clear that it's not going to change the overarching direction. I think the war in Ukraine has made a very clear illustration. I think if you say one thing, it's very black and white, basically. So if you say, if you recognize that this operation in itself was pretty impressive, pretty unprecedented, people are like, the Ukrainians are just going to steamroll the Russians. No, I'm not saying that. They have a manpower shortage, and a pretty bad one, right? What is the average age of troops at the moment? I think it's 44, right? And then people argue that's because they're trying to sort of preserve a younger generation, which, sounds pretty morbid to me. One, but two, also, I don't think that's accurate, actually. I think the Ukrainians have been trying to conscript all ages or across the demographic range, right, of men. Russia has a demographic issue too, but that's more just of a long-term demographics issue than it is in the immediacy of the conflict. So the peace talks I never thought they were going to go anywhere. Again, I like to naively hope that they might, but let's be realistic. And it is the summer, right? That is when most military movers do occur. And would we see some kind of, big response from the Kremlin of some form. The question always goes back to, will Putin use a nuke? I personally still don't think so, because it goes back to, China and all that stuff we touched upon in the beginning, which is, no country wants to be affiliated with another that is going to use a nuclear weapon. So it does make me wonder what kind of thing Putin might do in response to it, if he's going to do anything at all, because he's, time is ticking and he hasn't done anything yet. And sort of just what happens on the battlefield, but also Europe. I think the fanfare that we saw around Europe's initial, coalition of the willing and all these meetings being held after the security conference in Munich in February, it seems to have plateaued a little bit now. It's quite calm. So I don't know if the Europeans are actually going to follow through with some of the commitments that they say. This whole idea of sending troops to the front lines, French and British, has kind of dissipated. And I think it's more just about financial support again. So, we say one thing and then it seems to, the next day it goes backwards again. I think it was what you were saying, James, before as well, right? So anyway, that's sort of my final thoughts on the whole matter. We've covered a lot, so I'll pass it to you guys to say whatever you like.
One final thing I'll say here is really this question of whither Europe. I was asked this about a year and a half ago when I was here. I took a semester and I was here in New York, and we were teaching this in a conflict resolution class. And the question was, how relevant is Europe today without the United States?
Oh boy, here we go.
No. It's I don't have an answer to this, because the answer has yet to be answered. I think that is ultimately where we are now. How relevant is Europe without the United States? If the EU or various European leaders have decided that we're going to go it alone from the United States, which, right, let's also point this out. There's a temptation to just simply ride out Trump's term and expect things to go back to normal after he's out. I think that's a very dangerous strategy to take, because it presupposes that the Democrats are going to field somebody in 3 years that's going to be electable. I don't have many hopes for the Democratic Party these days. And that also presupposes the idea that Vance is not being groomed to continue on with the MAGA tradition, which many, many Republicans are now signing on to, because they see this as a winning strategy. So let's just say that Trump is out after this term, and yet another type of Trumpism continues. Yeah. Well, Europe, you better be prepared. Like Europe, you better be prepared, because if you're thinking of just riding this out and waiting for another brunch lib from the Democratic Party to come back in and make everything once again 1993, it's a stupid strategy. And I say this as an American. Okay, I say this as an American. Where Europe is going to go, again, they're still wedded to the belief of liberalism, which means that they are committed to doing everything to keep Ukraine alive, because it's reputation that's on the line. The United States, we can throw countries under the bus. We've done it, unless you're the UK or Israel. That actually remains to be seen about what Trump and Netanyahu are doing right now. But, we will abandon countries. Lindsey Graham, the man whom I viscerally despise that man. But he said something. Lindsey Graham has this nasty tendency of saying the quiet things out loud these days. And he said that, the worst thing the United States did in the last couple of years was pull out of Afghanistan, because that gave countries the understanding that America is weak. If we pull out of Ukraine, if we abandon Ukraine, that's it. Game over. The war of ideology has been lost. Now, Graham doesn't give a rat's ass about Ukraine. He cares even less about Ukrainians. He likes what's in Ukrainian soil, and he wants to make money off of it. Let's just be perfectly honest here. But what that tells us is that Ukraine is going to be propped up and will be able to somehow, hold their own against Russia for as long as is expedient. But what Ukraine will look like afterwards remains very much to be seen.
Oh, I'm muted. James, what do you think? Michael's pissed.
Yeah, Well, you know what? We're what? How many months are we now into Trump? 4 months?
5 months, right?
5 months.
Almost,
And
4.5, 5 months.
who was it who said overnight, let's see how popular Trump is and Trumpism is, when America's in recession and under and military on the streets.
Well, that tarmac's going to look great, isn't it? The tarmac's going to look great.
Yeah, the tarmac's going to look bloody wonderful. No, seriously. I mean, I'm not so sure. And that whole thing, Michael, you're right. Maybe Trumpism will try and survive, but it is a very particular leader that it's got, and I'm not sure that a lot of ordinary Americans will sign up and to somebody else. It's Trump. So yeah, maybe other Republicans will line up, but I think there's so many factors that I'm just not so sure that and it's a moving target. Look, I mean, where the conversation we were having 3 months ago is radically different from the one we're having now. I mean, I don't know, and this is what a lot of us are asking ourselves: is it simply because things have calmed down, or is it that we have now become so immunized? Because of course that's something that that's an amusing thought, of course, isn't it, with RFK and everything that he's going on about. But whether we just, the shock factor is gone. What we're still seeing is just crazy stuff, but it just doesn't seem quite as crazy because of everything that's been happening. So I'm not sure, but it's going to be fascinating to see. But I do have this sense that, and again, look, I accept that the jury's out on it. Has Trump now made this 5% demand for defense expenditure so he can flounce out of NATO? Or is this a realization that the United States actually still needs to be talking to the Europeans and other Western partners, can't completely alienate them as it was doing it? And so things maybe a little bit of moderation. I was about to say good sense, but I don't think that's the case. But a little bit of moderation based on the, bloody hell, what's going on here is kicking in. I mean, we don't have the answers at the moment. We don't know what's going on with them, but it just does seem that things are a little bit calmer at the moment. But Christ, I mean, and then you see the meltdown between Musk and Trump, which we haven't really spoken about, but why that was nuts.
Yeah, I mean, whatever you said, James, something bloody hell. I think that sort of sums it up, right? Just that, something bloody hell with Trump. You never know, really.
No.
My last thought would just be, I never want to be too pessimistic about Europe. I do believe that the continent has the ability to do it if it really pulls its finger out, which I think this time is different. I don't think we're going to be completely free of falling back into old habits, bad habits, but one likes to believe that, we do have a continent of half a trillion people. Sorry, what am I saying? 500 million people, one of the biggest economic agglomerations, so much history and culture. There's a lot here that I think Europe can do if we just do it right. And I do
absolutely
think more time now than ever, we need to be rid of our dependency, not just on America, but on any external entity, right? We need to be much more strategic and cognizant of how we approach things in Europe, and Trump's only going to continue to, I think, make that more of a necessity. But anyway,
can I just do a quick plug? I did a recent interview with a chap called Ian Kearns on my channel, where he's been a very, very strong advocate for Europe to do it and take control of its own security and defense, and he makes some very, very good arguments. And also, as a counter to what I've been saying, I think the United States seems to have calmed down, so at least a little bit. And so you're now hearing voices in Europe saying, well, maybe things aren't so bad. He's very, very clear that no, don't fall into that. Europe needs to be planning ahead for its own security and defense, even if things seem to have eased off a little bit at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, it's only been 5 months. That's the point. We sort of like, it feels like we've been at this for 2 years, and so
well, I mean, the key thing, of course, is going to be the NATO summit. That's going to be, and I think we'll have to do a live stream
for that. Yeah. Well, actually, that probably makes sense, doesn't it? Everybody, the NATO summit is in
2 weeks' time, June 24th to 26th, I believe. And not sure when the next Sunday is of that, but we can certainly cover it for the next episode. But I would just say, do follow Michael and James. They do incredibly great work in their respective ways.
Yourself, sir.
And follow me obviously as well, because I've got a fancy lamp and do fantastic hosting. I'm kidding, but no, it's always a pleasure doing it with these gentlemen. And if you enjoyed it, then do drop a comment on what you'd like us to do in the future. Some of the comments here have been hilarious today. I do want to just draw attention again to Michael. Are you going to hate on the Baltics again? This video is sponsored by USAID, as we said. We're all part of that. And to those of you for great insights and commentary. Anna, thank you. Exactly. But everyone, I think that's it from us.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thanks a lot, everyone. Speak soon. Take care. Bye.
Bye all.